Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. We're continuing our interview with Raja Khalidi. He's at the UNCTAD in Geneva. That's the UN Conference on Trade and Development, where he's currently Chief Office of the Director, Division on Globalization and Development Strategies. He speaks here today with his own opinions, which are not necessarily those of UNCTAD. Thanks for joining us again.
Nice to be back.
So let's just continue our discussion. As things unfold in Palestine and the other countries in the Middle East, we can start with Palestine. There's a tremendous role being played by Qatar and Saudi Arabia in virtually all of the countries that had an Arab Spring. They're very involved in Syria, arming the opposition. They're doing this in cooperation with the United States. There also Turkey seems to be part of this plan, at least as far as Syria goes. And when you look at what kind of Middle East they have in mind, I guess it's a reflection of what kind of countries Qatar and Saudi Arabia are to a large extent, although some of these countries are going to have elections and they're hoping the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power in these countries through the electoral process. But what kind of economies do they want to build?
Well, in the region, we haven't really seen from these new governments any significant change in their posture towards how they're going to go about resolving the economic problems that, in some cases, I suppose you could say, brought them to power. In Tunis, perhaps less so than in Egypt, it's been more pronounced in Egypt. Negotiations with the IMF led to a renewal of, we're not sure of all the details, but the renewal of some of the same conditionalities that perhaps in our view at least, contributed to the buildup of the socioeconomic pressures that contributed to the whole uprisings of last year. We haven't seen governments yet adopt a different posture in terms of their dealings with the international community. And of course they want, it's reasonable that these transitional situations, you don't want to scare off investors, you want to maintain whatever trade you've got set up as a result of many years of liberalization in all of these countries. So I don't think that there's, however, any realization yet among policymakers. I think there's a lot of discussion in the media, among experts, even among international organizations, of the extent to which different policies are required, different, in some cases significantly, to those that characterize the regimes of the past 20 years. But I don't see that trickling through to penetrating yet into any of the policy making that we've seen among Arab governments in the last 2 years.
I mean, the way it appears to me is you have Qatar and Saudi Arabia together with Turkey, but especially other than Syria, it seems mostly Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and then to a large extent Qatar, managing these Arab Spring revolutions from Libya to Egypt in a way that brings to power forces that will essentially carry on kind of neoliberal economic policies, privatization and open the markets to foreign capital and such, except instead of being done, for example, in Egypt under the dictatorship of Mubarak, it's now going to be done with some kind of democratic form, but with the face of it will be the Muslim Brotherhood, and perhaps not only in Egypt.
Look, I don't think the alliances that have been built so far between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries in general, and the new Muslim Brethren-dominated governments of Tunisia and Egypt are really predicated so much on the survival of an economic model. I think the survival of the endurance of the economic model comes from much deeper causes in sense. I mean, it's partly because you don't have policymakers in place who know anything else. This is the way that they've always dealt with the world, and they haven't yet internalized the extent to which the demands that continue to come up, and we've seen it even in the current showdown in Egypt, the economic and social demands continue to be, increasingly more urgently voiced in some cases, because nothing has been done to even indicate that a different approach is going to be taken to dealing with them. And so I think there's that. I think the problem, what I'm trying to say, is that the political alliances that you've mentioned are to do with other things. They're to do with ideology.
Do you not think this is partly about the Arab Spring kind of let loose a lot of democratic forces whose demands were not just about political democracy, but were also about more economic democracy, and wanted to question, how is stuff owned, and how is the the wealth of the country distributed, and do they not want to keep a lid on that?
I don't think they're worried about that. I think they're just worried about losing power, to be honest. I'm talking about now the regimes who have yet to be challenged, the monarchies in particular. That's what their main concern is, and keeping a lid on the region as a whole. I don't think that when they've promoted, be it in Syria or in Egypt or in Tunisia, political or other forces allied to them, it's been to so much because they're assured that these people will continue to run the same economic policies. I think the economic policies come along with other things in politics, in Arab politics, the economics, economic policies, of course it's important, and of course they want to maintain the models that that have made them, a lot of elites in the region very rich, through illegitimate as well as other, even sometimes sanctioned forms of pillaging, if you wish, of national resources. There's no doubt about that they want that there are a lot of forces that want to keep that system in place, and that know that this is being challenged widely. On the other hand, I think that at least in money, in Saudi Arabia at least, there was a major, and in some of the other Gulf countries, as the first Arab Spring, the original Arab Spring, if you want to call it that, erupted. By the summer of last year, of 2011, they had handed out some, I don't know, at least $50 billion in extra payments, transfer payments to households. So, in a situation where you have no organized, either at the national level in many of these countries or regionally, not only no organized opposition, but there's no real leadership for the Arab Spring movements, if you wish. There are different contenders to the thrones or to that title, but in general, this is still a very disparate movement. In each country, it has very different components, constituents and demands. So, I don't think they need to worry too much about those demands turning into new pressure. I think that the issues that are being hotly debated are unfortunately to do with sectarianism, that sort of and ethnic differences, and obviously political constitutional liberties and all of that as well. Those are determining the agendas of the political alliances in the region. The other thing I wanted to say, though, was that from the PLO's the perspective of the history of the PLO as a revolutionary movement in the region, which maybe it is no longer, but it certainly was in the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s, one could say. The PLO spent many years fending off Arab government's intervention, to the extent that they actually officialized it by having an executive committee that had factions, supported by Iraq, by Syria, etc. So it's nothing new to revolutionary movements in the region for governments, regimes who, even if these are not, the Palestinian case, it wasn't a revolutionary movement against the Arab regimes, but of course the Arab regimes certainly at the time and for many years wanted to make sure it didn't become one. So it was better for them to rally around and one could argue at different times, divert, etc., the PLO's course that it would have, and as a result of which the issue of the independence of the Palestinian decision, which is something that Yasser Arafat, was famous for always reaffirming as a way of implying I'm not subservient to any of the governments, etc. It's something that even Mashal the other day, the head of Hamas in Gaza, reiterated. So what I wanted to make the analogy I think that is pertinent is that the Arab uprisings, as I mentioned, without leaders clearly identified, without organization even to represent them in any way, are even a greater risk of intervention. And it's only natural that the governments of the region will want to suppress, divert, hijack, ride the wave, whatever. And we're seeing it in some cases, but we're also seeing it continue in Egypt, and I think even in the Palestinian case, we're seeing a continued popular, broad social base movement that is continuing to insist on the things that we heard even from Tahrir in the very first months of this whole episode of the last 2 years.
Okay, in the next segment of our interview, we're going to talk more about Palestine. Please join us for the next segment of our interview on the Real News Network.